The last section looks at the two hemispheres of the brain, and while they're separate and distinct, they might be able to bring together the various strands of what we've been talking about in this presentation, and unify, let's say, the student-centered with the teacher-centered view of learning. Back in the 1960s, people did a lot of research on the different hemispheres of the brain, one side being organized and rational, the other side being more intuitive and creative and artistic. And people made a lot of, let's say, personality inferences based on this, that some people were left-brained and other people were right-brain dominant. However, most of the succeeding brain research has disproved these notions. They still might be useful to describe things, but it's not really based on the brain research itself. However, recent research has shown that the two hemispheres do provide different functions, and this might give some insight in how people learn and how people think. In particular, Ian McGilchrist, in a book called The Master and the Emissary, has looked at the different parts of the brain and what they do for us as far as thinking and learning. Let's take a look at both sides in sequence. First, let's look at the right side. This is the one that's usually tied to imagination, intuition, emotion, our experiencing self, and also our ability to focus on the details of sensory experience, in common parlance, the trees versus the forest. And it's also this part of the brain that learning-driven and student-centered perspectives of education tend to focus on when they're looking at brain research. We do need in the intuition, because that allows us to see new things that we wouldn't see before. It's responsive to novelty and emotion. It's also however, has a lot of problems, and partially because it has a very, very narrow focus. It's kind of stuck in an eternal present, and therefore it doesn't have perspective, whether past or future, and is not able to put that sensory information in any useful way. The other part that McGilchrist points out is that it's also silent. It doesn't have a voice in the decisions made between the two hemispheres of the brain. So let's take a look at the other side. This is the side that mostly deals with reason, abstraction, the big picture perspective. It's the remembering self, which tells the memory how to use the sensory information coming in. It both constructs our past as well as structures our future. And to use the common parlance once again, it allows us to see the forest from the trees, the bigger picture and how things are integrated together. And this is really when people are talking about teacher-centered education and the value of it, these are the types of values and the parts of the brain that they would appeal to and think are critically important and sometimes lost in learning-driven perspectives. So let's take a step back though from McGilchrist and give an example of why you might need both parts. One, you need the right side of the brain because it's detail-oriented, and the other side gives you the bigger picture. And McGilchrist gives an example of the chicken. So when it's pecking for food, it needs one part of the brain to go and peck and find the small little pieces of corn that it might be eating, while it needs the other part of the brain to basically be on a broad scan for predators, and it needs to be able to do both to survive. Both parts are part of the learning process. In addition, we need to be able to separate our ability to need for abstraction, to decontextualize, and deal with the problems, the importance of that allows us to think in a certain type of way, but also not to get, let's say, ossified in that way of thinking. And the intuitive and the, let's say, the innovative side of the brain gives us that. It allows us to be individual. It allows us to evolve. It allows us to see things that are, let's say, not there before, and therefore inform, let's say, the thinking part of the brain. But as I said before, because the left side is the one that has the voice, in many ways that's the one that you have to teach and learn through, because that's the one that's going to control the other part of the brain. And if you want someone to learn better, you have to teach, let's say, the left side of the brain to tell the other side of the brain how to think and how to take in information. And we know this partially from experiments. We know when people lose the right hemisphere of the brain, they get an narrow window of attention, even to the point that stroke victims forget that they have strokes and might not even acknowledge the fact that they can't have control of one part of their body. That's the trouble of being stuck in the eternal present. And so it really does matter whether we need the big picture or the small picture. McGilchrist's final point, and really the conclusion of all this, is that we need both sides of the brain. We need the teacher-centered and the student-centered. We need the intuitive and the rational part of the brain, both for reason, but also to support imagination. And we need both of those parts of the brain and appeal to them in our lessons to make learning work the best. Thank you for listening to this presentation, and this is our conclusion.